Have you ever wondered where we really come from? Not just as humanity in general, but how different peoples, cultures, and ethnicities have formed throughout history? When we look at the scriptures, we find something fascinating. The Bible, such an ancient book, offers clues about the origin of all of us. And what if I told you that this very book contains answers about the origins of Black people and their significance throughout biblical history? What is hidden between these pages? Often we forget that the Bible is more than just spiritual stories. It also speaks about peoples, kingdoms, and entire civilizations, all with a common origin. The Bible invites us to explore not only the beginning of humanity with Adam and Eve, but also the diversity that emerges over time. Does the Bible speak directly about different ethnicities? And what does it specifically say about the African people and their connection to the scriptures? Believe it or not, some of the most impactful figures and powerful stories involve Black characters who, for a long time, did not receive the recognition they deserved. What does the Bible reveal about this? If you're as curious as I am to uncover these stories hidden between the lines, you'll want to stay tuned for the rest of this video. Believe me, the more we explore, the more fascinating it gets. And if you want to keep learning about deep and revealing biblical themes like this one, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next videos and will always be up to date with the revelations that will surprise you. The story begins in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. They are, according to the Bible, the first human beings created by God. And it's fascinating to think that from just two people, the entire diversity of humanity would unfold. But how exactly did this happen? The key lies in the generations that followed. Adam and Eve had children, and their descendants began to spread across the earth, giving rise to the first civilizations. Throughout generations, the Bible reveals more about this expansion. What started with a small family soon becomes a great diversity of peoples, languages, and cultures. Each carries the mark of its own history and purpose. But the interesting point here is that, even with all this diversity, the Bible shows us that we all come from a common origin. No matter the skin color or the place where people settled, all share the same lineage in Adam and Eve. And this idea of a common origin for humanity is something powerful. It makes us reflect on how, despite the differences we see today, there is a fundamental unity that connects us. But this doesn't mean the differences aren't important. In fact, it is precisely in the stories of the descendants of Adam and Eve that we begin to see how each people plays a specific role in the divine plan. And it is at this point in history that we reach Noah. After the Great Flood, when humanity essentially starts over, Noah and his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, become the new patriarchs of humanity. From them arise the different nations and peoples that populate the earth. Each of these sons represents a distinct branch of humanity. And this is where the diversity we know today begins to emerge, including the origins of African peoples. The Bible describes how Noah's sons spread out to different regions. Ham, in particular, is often associated with the peoples of the African continent. His descendants, according to the biblical account, established civilizations that would become influential and powerful. This includes places like Egypt and the land of Canaan. It is intriguing to realize that the Bible already mentioned these areas long before any modern study of ethnicities or ancient history. Isn't it fascinating? Through Ham and his descendants, we see the rise of peoples who would stand out for their culture, architecture, and influence. Even in ancient times, these civilizations had a significant role in the biblical narrative. They were not just mentioned in passing. They were an integral part of human history from the earliest post-flood moments. From Ham come figures who stand out not only for their mention in the scriptures, but also for the cultural and historical impact their descendants had. One of these descendants, perhaps the most famous, is Kush. From Kush comes the name of one of the ancient and powerful African kingdoms, a land rich in culture and history, often associated with the region of Ethiopia today. The mention of Kush in the Bible is not merely geographical. His descendants built civilizations that rivaled the great powers of the time in strength and wealth. When we look at the scriptures, we find several references to the people of Kush, their fertile lands, and their interactions with other biblical peoples. This reveals how significant these African nations were in the biblical context, long before they were explored by modern historians. And what is even more impressive is the way the Bible speaks of these peoples. They are not merely supporting characters in grand stories, but protagonists in important events. The lands of Kush, the descendants of Ham, appear at key moments in the biblical narrative, showing how these peoples have been part of God's plan from the very beginning. With the growth of nations after the flood, we reach the event that further shaped human diversity, the Tower of Babel. At this point in history, humanity, still united by a single language, attempted to build a tower that would reach the heavens. The goal? To make a name for themselves, defying the limits set by God. But this project, as we know, did not go as planned. Seeing the arrogant intent of humanity, God decided to confuse their languages, causing the nations to disperse. And this is where the diversity of peoples, languages, and cultures gains even more strength. Each group, unable to communicate with others, begins to spread across the world, settling in different regions and developing their own identities. The descendants of Ham, for example, migrated to areas we now associate with Africa, and there they flourished in their own civilizations. This moment marks a turning point in human history. It is not merely a linguistic division, but a true redefinition of humanity. From Babel, peoples begin to develop their own cultures and traditions, adapting to different territories. And so, the seeds of the great African civilizations were already planted from these early moments of dispersion. Among the descendants of Ham, one name stands out: Kush. He not only gave rise to an important lineage, but also to a kingdom that would become famous in the scriptures. The land of Kush, often associated with Ethiopia, is mentioned as a prosperous and powerful nation. This kingdom was known for its wealth, influence, and proximity to other great civilizations of the time, such as Egypt. Kush, the son of Ham, would be the patriarch of one of the most significant peoples of ancient Africa. Throughout the Bible, the land of Kush appears at several important moments. From the Old Testament, we see mentions of its warriors, its alliances, and of course its interactions with the people of Israel. A notable example is the Queen of Sheba, who many believe is connected to this region. She visited King Solomon, bringing treasures and showcasing the grandeur of her kingdom, one of the greatest of the time. The legacy of Kush and his descendants is profound. The civilization that emerged from this lineage was not just a military or political force, but also a cultural one. Their kingdoms, influences, and characters are evidence that African nations played a central role in the major biblical narratives, and this only reinforces the idea that the Bible is filled with stories of diverse peoples, all important to God's plan. The land of Kush was not the only African nation mentioned in the scriptures. Another significant figure is Egypt, which for a long time was one of the most influential centers of the ancient world. The Egyptians, descendants of Mizraim, another son of Ham, built one of the most advanced civilizations in history. Throughout the Bible, Egypt appears as a reference point, both in terms of power and cultural complexity. The story of Joseph, for example, is one of the most iconic moments linking the Hebrew people to Egypt. Sold into slavery, Joseph ends up becoming a central figure in the Pharaoh's court, saving not only Egypt from famine, but also his own family, the future Israelites. This interaction between African peoples and the descendants of Abraham shows that these nations were deeply connected, with Egypt playing a pivotal role in the biblical narrative. But Egypt symbolizes much more. It is both a place of refuge and a place of oppression. It is in Egypt that the Israelites grow and multiply, but it is also there that they become enslaved until God raises Moses to lead them out. What these events show us is that, in the grand divine plan, African nations were directly involved, playing essential roles in pivotal moments of biblical history. With Israel's exodus from Egypt, the connections between African peoples and the descendants of Abraham do not end. In fact, the influence and interactions continue. The Old Testament introduces us to other African peoples and kingdoms that, at crucial times, cross paths with God's people. Ethiopia, for instance, mentioned as Kush, appears again in prophecies, described as a nation of great strength and importance. In the prophetic books, there are mentions of alliances and even confrontations between Israel and African nations. The prophet Isaiah, for example, prophesies about Kush and Egypt, highlighting the role of these nations in fulfilling God's plans for the world. These prophecies reveal that African peoples were not merely spectators in the biblical narrative, but active agents in unfolding important events, including the expansion of God's kingdom. Additionally, when we look at the New Testament, we find more connections. One of the most fascinating examples is the Ethiopian eunuch, who appears in the book of Acts. This high-ranking official from the court of the Queen of Ethiopia was evangelized by Philip and baptized. This significant event symbolizes the arrival of the good news to African peoples, showing that the message of Jesus was destined to reach all corners of the earth, including the nations of Africa. The baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch was a transformative moment, not only for him but for the entire history of the Christian faith. The conversion of this high official symbolized the opening of the gospel to African nations, demonstrating that God's plan has always been to include all peoples. From this moment, we can imagine how the Christian faith began to spread across the lands of Ethiopia and beyond, with the eunuch possibly being one of the first to bring the good news to his people. But this wasn't the only time we see Africans playing significant roles in the New Testament. During Jesus' journey to Calvary, a man named Simon of Cyrene was compelled to carry Christ's cross. Cyrene, a city located in North Africa, had a significant Jewish community, and Simon was likely in Jerusalem for Passover. His brief but intense encounter with Jesus was one of the most poignant moments, immortalized in the Gospels. These details show us that Africans were not on the periphery of God's redemptive history. On the contrary, they were involved in crucial moments as witnesses, participants, and often as bearers of the faith. From the early pages of the Bible to key events in Christ's life, we see how African nations played a fundamental role, reinforcing the biblical view that God's plan has always included all peoples, without distinction. Reflecting on the impact of African nations on the biblical narrative, we see that these stories are not just relics of a distant past, but central elements that shape our understanding of God's plan for humanity. From the references to Kush and Egypt, to the crucial roles Africans played in the New Testament, it is clear that the Bible provides a rich and inclusive view of human diversity, showing that everyone, regardless of their origin, has a significant place in the divine story. These connections between the Bible and African nations reveal a fascinating and profound panorama. The history of Africans in the Bible is a powerful testament to how faith transcends boundaries and cultures, uniting all peoples in a common purpose. Each of these stories and figures contributes to the grandeur of the biblical narrative and offers an enriching perspective on the role of African nations in the global spiritual context. If you've been intrigued by these discoveries and want to explore more impactful biblical themes, be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. We have a variety of topics that delve into the stories and teachings of the scriptures in ways you may have never seen before. Subscribe to the channel and like the videos to stay updated on our next explorations and insights. Join us on this journey of discovery and understanding of the Bible in its fullness.